JRPGs are a divisive genre, to say the least. Some people can't get enough of them, while others are bored to tears almost as soon as the game starts. One fact, though, is that the genre has a lot of depth and variety, and some iterations are more interesting than others. A central source of these differences is in the combat. How does each game have you defeat your enemies? Obviously, this video is mostly my opinions, but I want to walk through the history of the types of JRPG combat I find most compelling, and how various series have built on each other and evolved over the years. To start, let's define what I mean by JRPG combat. The acronym stands for Japanese Role-Playing Game, and Wikipedia defines a role-playing game as a game in which players assume the roles of characters in a fictional setting. This definition is pretty unsatisfying since, by one that broad, everything from Halo to Super Mario Strikers to Diddy Kong Racing counts as an RPG. So, I'm going to set up my own definition for the sake of this video. I specifically want to talk about JRPG combat as controlling one or more player characters that have stats that the player develops, and engaging enemies in isolated encounters. This probably wouldn't work as necessary and sufficient conditions, since some JRPGs will fall through the cracks, but I think you all get what I'm talking about. Think Pokémon and Golden Sun rather than Dark Souls or something like The Witcher. So, where does the JRPG start? I would point to Dragon Quest as the original iteration of a JRPG from which all the others spawn. People had been adapting Dungeons & Dragons since the beginning of computer games, but most of those games didn't even have graphics, and Dragon Quest pioneered much of what we associate with the genre today. Released for the NES on May 27, 1986, the player controls an intrepid hero who levels up and grows stronger as the game progresses. The combat is conducted entirely through menus, with the player selecting what actions to take in a turn-based system alternating with the enemy. Given that this game is more than 30 years old, it's kind of amazing how much of it has stuck around in the JRPGs of today. Mana, health bars, gaining experience, separate menus for attacks and spells and items, all of these were present in the OG JRPG. However, beyond that, this game is pretty dry. One of the key things holding this title back is the singular player character. You only get to make one move per turn, and the hero character will develop the same way every playthrough. That changes, though, with the release of Dragon Quest II. Dragon Quest II is quite similar to the first game, but with one key difference. You again control a blue hero with a sword and decide to save the world, but will quickly discover that you can't do any magic. That's because DQ2 made the important innovation of giving the player a party of adventurers instead of just one. As you progress through the story, your prince is soon joined by another prince, who is a hybrid physical attacker and magic user, and then a princess, the series' first dedicated mage. The party system is doing several important things here. First, getting to make 3 decisions per turn is a lot more interesting than just making one, so the gameplay is instantly better. Second, giving the player more characters opened up the enemy encounters to having multiple foes at once. Varied enemies forces the player to prioritize some targets over others, again making the combat deeper. Finally, the 3 separate characters all have different strengths and weaknesses, which will be a staple in nearly every JRPG going forward. When you only had one character, that character kind of needed to be good at everything in order to function, so the variety wasn't really possible. 11 months after Dragon Quest II's release, we begin what is possibly the most famous JRPG series of all time in Final Fantasy. After researching for this video and learning that DQ2 was the first to use a party system, I began to wonder if early Final Fantasy did any innovating at all. After poking around a bit, I've concluded that the original FF did 2 important things as far as the history of JRPGs is concerned. First, it made the decision to take the game to the third-person perspective in combat rather than the first. I was surprised that it was the first game to do this because nowadays it seems so obvious. I'm sure the early games were going for a sense of immersion with the first-person perspective, but being able to look at your characters is basically universal in RPGs today. Looking at the original Final Fantasy is striking, if only because this layout is virtually identical to a game I'm going to talk a lot about later on. Square definitely figured out something important here. Secondly, Final Fantasy implemented assignable jobs. This isn't quite as fundamental as the third-person thing, since not every RPG uses this, but many do, and it's a nice system. Letting the player choose how their character functions gives a new level of agency, and choosing how your character will develop is fun and rewarding. Related to the increased player role in character development, Final Fantasy also allows the player to pick and choose which spells to buy instead of learning them from a scripted list at certain levels. Again, this isn't a mainstay of JRPGs, but it was picked up to some extent in series like Pokémon, where the player picks and chooses which moves their characters will have available. At this point, the genre begins to stagnate a bit. Titles like Final Fantasy III basically just cleaned up interface elements while leaving the actual gameplay untouched, and it wasn't clear how or when things would be shaken up. The next big change, and a split in how JRPG combat was designed, occurred in 1991 with the release of FF4. On its surface, things like stats and isolated encounters and combat via menuing are the same, but the key difference was the introduction of a real-time element. In a traditional JRPG, the player can take as long as they like on every decision. In FF4, each character has a gauge that gradually fills up, and the player can have them take an action once it's full. On one level, this forces the player to make decisions more quickly, as the game won't wait all day for them to choose something to do. However, and this is just my opinion, the real-time element actually makes the game progress more slowly, and combat begins to drag once the player becomes skilled enough. The thing about turn-based combat is that it actually progresses as quickly as the player wants it to, so you're never stuck waiting on the game. To step outside the proper chronology a bit, this is a mechanic that I think plagues most later Final Fantasy games. Many of them choose to lean into this active time battle format, and while some people find it compelling, I've never been able to get into it. Watching a bar fill up while I don't really have anything to do is not exactly peak gameplay. Final Fantasy XII's combat was fairly boring, and it was made even worse in FF13 when the player lost control of party members besides Lightning. I just want to feel like I'm doing something, not standing around and waiting on the game to let me play. Depending on the degree to which these real-time elements are incorporated, combat can range from something like Final Fantasy VII, which is a pretty typical JRPG with a weird quirk to the combat, all the way to games like the Tales franchise, where combat bears basically no resemblance to the original Dragon Quest anymore. You could go on for weeks about the different ways to handle combat in an RPG, so I'm going to rein it in and just talk about the primarily menu-based games. So, back to the chronological approach. After 4, Final Fantasy games continued to use the ATB format for their combat. The next important innovation appeared first in FF6 and was properly refined in number 7. What I'm referring to is a set of abilities collectively referred to as Limit Break. 6 did it first with the introduction of Desperation Attacks, powerful moves unleashed when the character is at critically low health. These Desperation Attacks were a great and important innovation because it introduced something that JRPGs tended to lack: peak moments of excitement and action. In general, the gameplay in a turn-based RPG tends to be a war of attrition, with the player gradually making decisions that wear the opponent down. This can be satisfying, but is not particularly exhilarating. If Desperation Attacks have a flaw, it's that the player has little agency over them. They activate randomly, and surprise can definitely lead to excitement, but people who play RPGs tend to want their character to do as instructed. Also, the conditions to get one are simply too restrictive. Your character must take the attack option while below 1/8 of their health, and then it still only has a 1 in 16 chance to trigger. Most of the time when a character is that low, the player really wants to heal them, so it's possible to play through FF6 and never have one of these come up. Not a great sign for the mechanic. Final Fantasy VII cleaned up this system a bit with the eponymous Limit Break mechanic. Now a gauge rather than a threshold, it fills up as characters take damage, and the player also gets to choose when to activate it. Now we've got those moments of high excitement combined with player agency in a compelling way. Moving on, the next important game to mention is Final Fantasy X. This game is one of the FF titles most different from its immediate predecessors, so I want to break down those changes and why they're important. First, this is the first game since Final Fantasy III to go back to turn-based combat without a real-time element. It's not strictly the same as the old titles, since being fast can allow a character to take multiple turns per rotation, but is overall much closer to them than to, say, Final Fantasy VII. This change back to turn-based combat forced another innovation that had sort of been taken for granted during the era of ATB. One somewhat frustrating thing about old RPGs is that it is totally opaque in what order the characters and enemies are going to take their turn. If a character desperately needs to be healed, to some extent you just have to pray that your healer gets to move before the enemies finish your comrade off. ATB mitigates this somewhat because you can watch the gauges and know whose is going to fill up first, but the relative turns of the enemies are still mostly unknown. FF10, though, shows you the exact order in which both allies and enemies will be taking their turns, giving the player enough information to plan ahead more precisely. Once again, Final Fantasy is foreshadowing mechanics present in great games that come much later. Secondly, the game throws away one of the most traditional parts of JRPGs, the experience and leveling system. Characters still gain levels at set experience amounts, but these levels don't actually do anything in themselves. Instead, the level allows characters to move around the sphere grid, a huge map of abilities and stat upgrades. All stat increases come from this grid, as do all spells and special attacks. This system pushes the idea of player agency over character progression to the absolute limit. Characters have a natural path that is easy to follow and will place them in certain roles, but the player can functionally choose to make every character into whatever they please. This doesn't become the JRPG standard or anything, but it was different and interesting enough that I thought it was worth noting. Skill trees are common in RPGs like Diablo or World of Warcraft, but less so in JRPGs and basically never to this extent. Another change comes in this game's variation of the limit break system, called Overdrive. Overdrives are character unique and require different real-time inputs, but the important addition here is that of Overdrive modes. Instead of just charging when a character takes damage, although that is the default, the player can unlock different ways to charge their overdrive. Letting the healer charge her powerful ability through healing, or the warrior do so by killing enemies, gives the player more freedom to decide how they want to play the game. This further increased player agency in the limit break system allows players to set up big moments where they break a fight wide open, which is extremely satisfying. Lastly for this game, I want to talk about enemy weaknesses in JRPGs. The idea of enemies being weak to a certain type of attack is as old as role-playing itself. Of course you wanted to hit the fire elemental with a water attack. However, these would often be restricted to elemental weaknesses like the above, or holy magic versus undead, or something like that. What interests me about FF10's combat is how enemies are also weak to certain types of basic attacks. Heavily armored enemies can be easily killed by the hugely powerful Auron and Kimahri, but will shrug off blows from the weaker Titus. Flying enemies can be sniped down by the ranged Wakka, but will evade someone like Auron, and fast and agile enemies are too quick for anyone but Titus to hit easily. The key feature here is that it opens up people besides magic users to hitting enemy weak points. Weaknesses are a good idea in themselves, but an enemy being weak to fire only really opens up gameplay options for the mage in a party. The melee fighters just have to swing away as usual. This idea of every character having the ability to exploit certain weaknesses is going to feature in basically every game I talk about from here on out, making this title pretty damn important. So, to summarize, JRPG combat, as I'm referring to it, involves menu-driven, usually turn-based combat in closed encounters, and feature the player using their gradually developed character against the enemies. The key innovations so far have largely come from Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, and include a party of adventurers, a third-person perspective, and some form of high-intensity moments, usually from big attacks you gradually build up. I'm now going to jump to the game I think made the next huge innovation, Persona 3. Persona 3 checks most of the boxes above, with the weird exception being that party members outside of the protagonist are not directly controlled. We'll talk more about that later. The important thing to note is that enemies generally have several weaknesses, initially hidden from the player, and each allied character has both physical and elemental attacks. Instead of merely doing extra damage, a unit being struck by one of their weaknesses is knocked down, and the character that made the attack gets an additional turn. To understand why this is important, let's take a moment to talk about the issues with JRPGs as a whole. One consistent complaint lodged against JRPGs is the amount of grinding that is often required. Setting aside the main story to beat up on random encounters is not most people's favorite thing to do, and lesser RPGs will often require a ton of grinding to pad out their game. One thing that can make grinding worse than it has to be is what those random encounters look like. If enemies have a lot of health, those fights can take several minutes each and tend to be an absolute slog. There's a weird tension in these games where numbers are king. If the player is strong enough to instantly wipe out enemies, how do you make the encounters compelling and exciting the first time you run into them? You can try to make a smooth difficulty curve, but there's no guarantee players will reach a certain point and not be significantly stronger or weaker than you expected. Most of the time, the result is long dungeons feeling agonizing as you beat the same mob of enemies for the 15th time and it taking forever every time. To solve this, Persona did something really clever. What I said about knocking enemies down? Well, when all the enemies in a pack are knocked down at the same time, the player can perform an all-out attack, which most of the time serves to execute the entire pack at once. The important note here is that there are quite a few damage types, and enemies usually only have a few weaknesses. So the first time you encounter a specific enemy, the process is mostly trial and error, and plays out like a normal JRPG fight. New enemies are scary and will tax both your health and mana, just like in a normal dungeon crawl. The difference is in the second, third, and so on encounters with the same enemy. Now that you've learned what to hit each enemy with, you can make quick work of them. This allows the player to use a display of their knowledge and skill to get out of those boring, grindy fights. An A+ idea, if you ask me. The idea, that is, rather than the execution. As I said earlier, you don't control your allies in this game. The protagonist will usually have access to a bunch of types of damage, but often won't be able to knock down the whole mob by himself. Even if the player can knock down 3 out of 4 enemies, their final turn is then basically wasted, and they need to pray that their allies will intelligently exploit the final enemy's weakness. This leads to an extra level of tedium and frustration even beyond the default for a game where you rely on NPCs to not be dumb. And that's a pretty high floor of frustration, as basically any gamer can attest. So, we've invented something that solves a core issue with JRPG combat, but the implementation was pretty suspect, so the combat in P3 is still not amazing. Luckily, we as a modern audience can move right along to Persona 4. P4 did some more minor things, like removing the different damage types on physical weapons, but mostly it just let the player control all 4 active party members at once if they want to. The difference from this one change is night and day, and overall P4 is a really pleasant JRPG to play. The combat generally just works, and of the games I've mentioned in the video so far, this is my favorite even more than a decade after its release. However, a couple things make it imperfect. The weirdest thing to me is how not all of the elements are created equal. Fire, ice, wind, and electricity all function much the same, and weaknesses are often intuitive to figure out and exploit. There are 2 more elements though in light and dark, and the way these behave is really strange. The only light and dark spells in this game are one-hit kill moves with low accuracy, reminiscent of Whack in the Dragon Quest games, or moves like Fissure or Guillotine in Pokémon. The obvious problem with this, in the context of why you want to exploit weaknesses in Persona, is a weakness to light or dark becomes pretty pointless. It's almost like the functionality of these elements was decided before the knockdown system was, and they just never added proper damaging spells for these elements. Most enemies have another weakness, and so you can often get around the issue, but it still detracts from the game and feels pretty pointless to me. The other issue doesn't come up much, but is extremely frustrating when it does. I mentioned earlier that the final turn in a chain is mostly wasted, and that continues to be true. If 3 enemies are weak to wind and 1 is weak to fire, Yosuke doesn't really have anything to do with his 4th turn after knocking down everyone that he can. You can just guard or attack or use an item or whatever, and this is mostly fine. Just wait for Yukiko's turn, and then she can blast the guy weak to fire, and everything will be hunky-dory. The problem is that your player characters usually won't take all their turns in a row. If an enemy is knocked down at the start of their turn, they get back up, closing the window for an all-out attack. If even one of the enemies that Yosuke knocked down takes their turn before Yukiko gets to go, then you don't get your all-out attack and have to grind through the fight as normal. This can be really frustrating, as all your planning and knowledge and decision-making can be screwed over by something as simple as the turn order, which is hidden from the player and often difficult to be sure of. Again, I really like this game overall, but a flaw that turns trash mobs into tedious fights 10% of the time is still 10% more than I want in my game. Fortunately, Atlus is a good company that learns from experience, so now we get to move on to what I would probably call the best JRPG of all time, Persona 5. It gets that title from the beautiful visual design, music, story, characters, and a bunch of other things, but crucially, it also has a truly excellent combat system. The core of Persona 4's combat has been retained, with a couple damage types added. Nuclear and Psychic function mostly the same as the other elements. The increased number merely means that the protagonist has to cover more weaknesses by himself, and teammates are more for utility and raw damage. Gun damage is new and is odd in that anyone can use it, but everyone's gun functions differently and has different amounts of ammunition. This forces the player to ration bullets in a long dungeon run and decide who can take down gun-weak enemies in a given fight. Light and Dark have also been given proper damaging spells while retaining their slew of one-hit KO moves, so now they're actually functional weaknesses while retaining their insta-kill quirk. The biggest change though is the introduction of Baton Pass. When a character downs an enemy and gets their extra turn, instead of acting themselves, they can choose to pass that extra turn on to another party member. It's difficult to overstate how much this smooths out and improves the gameplay. No more enemies getting up halfway through your combo, no more wasted turns. The player is still required to think in order to set up the ideal chain, but if they plan ahead a little and know what the enemy weaknesses are, most enemy mobs are suddenly trivialized. This makes long dungeons infinitely less agonizing, while still retaining the challenge and danger the first time you face a new enemy. Also, this isn't really a gameplay thing, but in the previous two games, an all-out attack was just a big, goofy dust cloud. In P5, you get a slick animation followed by a nice piece of stylized art and a quote depending on which character executed it. The moment becomes more satisfying, letting the player feel smart and cool and powerful. Downing and then executing mobs takes random encounters from being a chore to being a truly satisfying core gameplay loop. Unfortunately, even this game is not all sunshine and rainbows. I've talked at length about how Persona made the minute-to-minute regular encounters more pleasant, but one area where they're a bit lacking is the quality of the boss battles. In most games, boss battles are meant to be the most epic and fun part of the game. Exciting showdowns where you blow every resource you have against an enemy that will crush you if you hold back. Importantly, boss battles are usually extensions of what the player has learned throughout the rest of the game. You intuitively know to try and make the King Dodongo eat a bomb because that's how you beat the little Dodongos leading up to him. The problem with Persona is that it's built its entire gameplay system on learning about and then invalidating enemies. They obviously don't want bosses to just get blown up with one strike to their weak point, so most bosses just don't have weaknesses at all. So now we're at a point where the bosses don't get invalidated, but the player's primary tool for dealing with enemies doesn't really work either. Bosses tend to have some sort of gimmick to try and keep things interesting, but mostly they devolve into just keeping up as much damage per turn as you can while avoiding death. Turns don't really require decisions because every character just does their highest DPS move every time, with occasional breaks to buff or heal allies. This also leads to characters feeling a little samey, such as Makoto and An both offering big AoE magic damage and big team-wide heals, and both of them taking one of those two options almost every turn. Boss battles in Persona 5 aren't boring per se, but they aren't as satisfying or interesting as I'd like them to be. They're a slight low point in an otherwise fantastic and exceptional game. Which brings us to the end of the road. The last game I want to talk about today is Octopath Traveler, featuring the gold standard of JRPG combat. Combat in Octopath Traveler can be looked at as the culmination of some of the best ideas from the Persona series, but adapted to fix the main problems. The core is good old Final Fantasy I turn-based combat, down even to the layout of the fights. Players pick options from menus, have health and mana, yada yada yada. From Persona, we have enemies with set spreads of weaknesses that are initially hidden from the player, but that stay revealed as you uncover them. Similar to P3, we've brought back different physical damage sources based on the type of weapon a given character is using. Characters by default have at least 2 types of damage they can deal, and usually more, so everyone can contribute to nearly any fight. It diverges, though, in what happens when you exploit an enemy's weakness. Instead of just doing more damage or instantly knocking the enemy down, this little number next to the enemy's weaknesses ticks down each time one is hit. When the number hits 0, that enemy is stunned for all turns currently shown on the turn order, remember the turn order from Final Fantasy X? And they're broken. This broken state persists until they get a turn again, and while broken, enemies take massively increased damage. So, let's break down exactly what this system does and why it's amazing. First, it retains the good parts of Persona 5's all-out attack system. Early encounters with an enemy type are difficult and involve learning and trial and error. Once you've done your homework though, the enemies fold pretty easily to having their weaknesses exploited. Random enemies can be threatening at first, without being tedious later. Gold star. Secondly, it doesn't inherently diminish boss fights. Bosses have a lot of health, and stealing one turn plus dealing increased damage isn't usually enough to just end a fight. You get to use the skills you've learned to get an advantage, but not one that just takes the wind out of these scary enemies. Thirdly, the numerical element of the break system gives the developers way more freedom to play around with what different enemies can do, and this serves to make bosses much more exciting. Some bosses will rotate what they're weak to at certain points in the fight, some will guard some of their weaknesses while certain conditions are met, and most will increase the amount of hits it takes to break them each time you do so. This gives the player a conundrum. Do I break the enemy as quickly as possible to get my advantage and start working on the next break? Or do I need to save those crucial turns for when the boss is low on health and starts getting scarier? This ties into the final feature I want to talk about in Octopath's combat, the BP system. Battle points are a resource generated at the start of every turn that the player can spend to empower their actions. When used on a weapon attack, the weapon will strike additional times, while with magic it empowers the spell. This mechanic takes the pros from something like Limit Break and marries it to Octopath's already great break system. The player can choose how to spend their BP for moments of maximum power and excitement, including supremely powerful attacks that can only be used by expending BP. At the same time, unlike Limit Break, BP has many uses, which means the player needs to make choices. Do they power up a basic attack to get as many hits towards breaking the boss as possible? Or do they use it on one big attack once the boss is already broken, for truly catastrophic damage? Do they unleash it all at once for maximum impact, or just use one point at a time for several heals or buffs? There are as many ways to expend BP as there are actions to take, giving this system a level of depth well beyond similar mechanics like Overdrive. The end result is a game that's satisfying and fun to play from the beginning to end, from small encounters to big, and all the hundreds of fights in between. As it happens, the closest precursor I could find for Octopath's BP system is that of Brave Points, found in the game Bravely Default. This makes sense since Octopath's producer, Tomoya Asano, previously did work on those games. For those not aware, Bravely Default is a JRPG that started development as a sequel to Final Fantasy: The Four Heroes of Light, already a spin-off from the mainline Final Fantasy games. I like how well this example shows the interconnectedness of a genre where all the developers and franchises are constantly learning from one another. I'm sure I missed some milestones in there somewhere, but it's tough not to when talking about 30 years of games across dozens of franchises and potentially thousands of individual titles. I'll be interested to see if JRPGs can continue to innovate and find new ways to make their combat exciting in a myriad of scenarios. Think I missed something important? Feel free to tell me in the comments below. If you like this type of long-form analysis content, be sure to subscribe to the channel and see the rest of my stuff as it comes out. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.